seeing and hearing is Augmented Yangtze, the latest release from Arturia Instruments. It's a virtual instrument in their Augmented series, which is a very simple concept, combining traditional instruments, whether it's woodwinds or bowed strings, with synthesizers. And while it doesn't particularly recreate the sound of these instruments in an accurate way, it's more about using the textures and the feeling of these instruments and creating brand new augmented tones. But what's particularly special about Augmented Yangtze is that it's not a particular family of instruments, rather it's a culture of instruments. This is the first regionally specific augmented series, in this instance, China. Traditional Chinese instruments, which just so happens to be my bread and butter. I've lived and worked in China for 7 years now, and traditional Chinese instruments are my specialty. It's what I do. I've made a whole career out of learning these instruments, playing them, and trying new things with them to great success. And when I see this interface, when I see what this instrument can do, I can't help but feel that this was tailor-made just for me, but I also think it represents so much opportunity for not only a worldwide audience to see and hear these instruments, maybe not for the first time, but maybe your first time trying and using some of these, but also it's a very good opportunity for local artists as well to use the instruments that they're intimately familiar with in new and interesting ways. So this tutorial is for beatmakers and ambient artists and anyone who wants to get a taste of what these traditional Chinese instruments can offer, but it's also for traditional Chinese artists trying their first electronic tone, making use of the traditional Chinese instruments in new and exciting ways. So, in this tutorial, I'm going to go over pretty much the entire plugin. I'm going to give you a full walkthrough. I'm not going to go too in-depth into every little feature, but I am going to give you a good overview, and we're going to create instruments from the ground up. If you've never used a virtual instrument before, this isn't a bad place to start. I understand it might be a little daunting. We're going to go part by part. Once you have this up and installed, then getting through the actual instrument shouldn't be too hard. So have a look at the chapter list, have a look at how this tutorial is going to be laid out, and if you feel you already understand one of the core concepts, feel free to skip around. Again, this is going to be a very 101 tutorial, and we're going to go from the very beginning of the software to the very end. And believe it or not, I actually came up with a name for Augmented Yangtze. When Arturia reached out, as they're expanding into China, I helped them demonstrate their stuff here at the expos and whatnot. They needed a name for it, and they wanted to come up with something that is, regional, specific to China, but not necessarily just augmented China. So they needed a naming convention, so I helped them pick this geography-based, harmless, cool-sounding naming convention. So, I'm pretty proud of that. And it means a lot to me because this instrument is just so near and dear to me. Upon opening Yangtze for the first time, you're greeted with a very, very pretty interface, and the interface actually changes based on what instrument you're using. Up here, we have our presets. These are instruments that have already been made, and when you load up Yangtze, you've got all sorts of different presets here to play with. So I think the default is this one called Windy Day, and if I were to play some MIDI notes here, well, that's just gorgeous. In the middle of the interface, we have these knobs. These knobs are called your macros. The macros change something about your sound, and they're all aptly named. For example, if we were to add some motion, you can hear it's doing something over the course of time. This is how motion works. Morph will just make a large change to the tonality of the sound you're playing. Time usually affects the way the instrument is played, whether it's, sort of a faster attack and a quick note here. If you lengthen the time here, then the instrument will generally be a longer, slower sound. Color usually refers to the brightness of the sound. And of course, you've got your FX controls down here. You can add delay and reverb. It's all pretty simple. Now, the knobs are all very straightforward, easy to use, and they're geared for performance. But to actually change the instrument and to build our own, we'd have to go into the advanced window. Now, there's a lot happening here, and if you're new to software instruments, I don't blame you for being a little overwhelmed by the look of this. But if we start from scratch, we build our own instrument and block off the stuff that we're not using, it should make some sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to load up a default patch, which is just a plain, unaffected, bare bones sound. You can tell it's already quite a bit simpler. The way Augmented works is it combines 4 sounds, up to 4 sounds. There are 2 types of sounds. We have a sampler and a synthesizer. Samplers play back pre-recorded sounds, such as the traditional instruments we'll be working with, and the synthesizers generate tones. They're different types of sound synthesis. And we're going to work with just one as we kind of go through the instruments and hear what they sound like. So I'm going to turn off the synthesizers, and I'm going to turn off the second sampler here. We have sampler 1. We have just one sound source. And playing back, we hear a very simple Guqin sound. So I'm going to walk you through these instruments one by one and just give you a little bit of context as to what they are and, the sounds that they produce and, how they compare and contrast. If you're not particularly interested in the history and all that of these instruments, feel free to just skip through, but there's some good stuff in here. For example, let's start with the woodwinds, the bass Dizi. The Dizi is a bamboo flute, very ancient history, although the sound that we're used to is actually pretty contemporary. It was made out of bamboo. And recently, within the past 100 years, they started to add like a copper lining on the inside of it. But the really iconic Dizi sound, if we hear it here, you hear it's a little bit like nasally. And that's because between the embouchure and the fingering holes, there's a little extra hole, and that hole is covered with a membrane. What that membrane is traditionally made out of, I'm not sure. I think it was like a gut, like animal gut, but now it's paper. So it resonates. It's a bamboo flute with like a little tiny paper resonator, which is so interesting. So that definitive Dizi sound is kind of what makes it sound like a Chinese instrument, and it really is representative of the Chinese sound. So when you hear this sort of like nasally bamboo flute, that is essentially a Chinese texture because it is a Chinese instrument with that very particular mix of bamboo, copper, and paper membrane. So that's the Dizi. In particular, this is a bass Dizi, which adds a couple notes in the lower register, so you get these kind of like warbly lower notes here. In real life, the Dizi is actually a pretty shrill instrument. It's very, very loud, first of all, and that nasally higher frequency does tend to scratch the ears a little bit. But Arturia did a very good job at recording the instrument so that a lot of the frequency is sort of removed, and it's a very nice... Every instrument in this collection has been sampled in a number of different ways. The instrument is played with a number of different techniques. The swell is sort of your standard long, breathy note. But you also have staccato. Staccato would be maybe a little better for a melody. And you have these sort of random sounds, random staccato, random swell. These are longer notes with a bit of like arrhythmic flair to it. Really nice for building long, sustained textures with some time effect to it. So that's the bass Dizi sound. The Dizi is a sharp contrast to the Xiao. The Xiao is the other woodwind in this collection, and the Xiao is in the same family as the much more known shakuhachi, a straight bamboo flute without any sort of resonance chamber. Xiao, another just ancient instrument, has a much more breathy, smooth sound. So if you're looking for a woodwind sound without the nasally texture, Xiao is the one you're looking for. And again, much like the bass Dizi, we have all the different sampling methods, the random staccatos here. And we have a staccato, which is, a sharper air, a little bit faster, shorter note. So those are our two woodwinds. The rest of the instruments are all string-based. The Erhu is often referred to as the Chinese fiddle. It's a two-stringed, sort of upright fiddle instrument with a resonance chamber on the bottom, but the resonance chamber is interesting. It's very thick wood, and the face of it has a skin. The skin, kind of like a banjo, but in this case, it's traditionally made out of snake skin. So the string is vibrating, and the sound is reflecting off of snake skin. Much like the Dizi, it's got a sort of a nasally tone to it, but it's a very sharp sound. The Erhu is often a solo instrument and a leading instrument because its tone is very, very piercing. The instrument has been sampled very, very well, so the tone is very usable. So, like the flutes, the Erhu also has different methods of being played. The pizzicato is like plucking the string, which is a traditional method of playing the instrument, to contrast the bowing. And we've got trills, we've got octaves and vibrato. These instruments are often very, very expressive. Erhu, again, quintessential, iconic, traditional Chinese folk sound. Used in orchestras and in folk music, Erhu is just a very, very iconic traditional Chinese sound. It's also the only bowed instrument in this collection. The other instruments are plucked and struck. The Guqin, for example. The Guqin is a sort of zither. I actually have one right here. I didn't plan to break this one out. I just realized I had one here. It's not mine, it's my girlfriend's. This thing is so far above my pay grade because it is so vividly complex in the nature in which it's played, in which it's studied. It's a Confucian tool of self-refinement. I mean, you're supposed to just have one in your home and sit, have a cup of tea, and focus, and meditate, and learn, study a very complex library of vocabulary, hand positions, notes, and arrangements. It is a very deep instrument, which has been played for thousands of years. 7 strings across, the notes are, played much like a slide guitar. Sliding is one of the 3 methods of playing the instrument. It's actually, if I'm right, there's these 3 tiers of sound. The sound of the earth, the sound of the sky, and the sound of the heavens. Sound of the earth, don't quote me on this, I think it's the plucked sound. The sound of the sky being the bending notes. And the sound of the heavens being harmonics. I'm going to put this thing away before I embarrass myself, but of all of the instruments, this is the one with the richest history, and this is the one that is so vividly complex, which leads me to discuss the nature of Augmented Yangtze. Yangtze is not going to accurately portray how these instruments are played, because so much of any acoustic instrument really is about expression and about the different methods of which you play, switching quickly between, say, a sustained note and a bent note and a pizzicato or staccato. Being able to transition between the different playing styles very, very quickly is what makes an instrument sound like it's being played by a human. Augmented Yangtze does not do that. The augmented series are not about making it sound like you're playing the instrument for real. Rather, it's about using the textures. So my first impression of the Guqin was that it doesn't capture all the nuance of how the instrument's played. It sounds very MIDI, right? It doesn't sound real, but that's exactly what you would want when you're building a new sound. I mean, being able to play harmonics in a chord like this. That's what the Augmented series is about. It's about using the texture, the tonality of these instruments to create something new. So, as you sort through these instruments and you hear the different methods in which they're played, just remember that there's a whole world of instrumentation out there. And if you ever really fall in love with one of these instruments, don't hesitate to pick one up off Craigslist. I got my first guzheng off Craigslist in Philadelphia for like $80. So, the instruments are out there. Definitely recommend grabbing one if you really, really particularly fall in love with one. Pipa, often referred to as the Chinese guitar, which I don't necessarily think is the most accurate, but it's a teardrop-shaped, upright, played 4-stringed instrument, but it's got a very interesting build. It's usually solid body or resonance body, but there's no sound hole. It's just strings reflecting off of wood. Without that sound hole, the sound is much more percussive, and as such, the instrument is usually played very, very aggressively. Of course, it could be mellow and pretty, but the notes are often plucked very, very intently. Much like the Guqin, we've got flams, we've got vibratos. Tremolo is, again, another quintessential skill of playing the pipa because it doesn't have a very long sustain. So if you want to hold a note for a long time, you've got to tremolo. So pipa is a good one, and if you're a guitarist, the pipa might be the one that you would be the most apt to try and play for yourself. They're a lot of fun. Highly recommended. The last string instrument is the Yangqin. The Yangqin is hilariously similar to the dulcimer, with the hammered dulcimer. It's got, I couldn't even tell you how many strings, but it's suspended strings over bridges, and you would strike them with little bamboo hammers. The instrument is gigantic and very, very heavy, often made of very, very heavy wood, so the resonance is really, really strong and interesting sounding. Now, of all of the instruments, this is the one that is the most polyphonic. It has the most notes being able to be played at one time. And like the others, you've got your different sampling methods, you've got your random. This one's nice. The bounce is like letting the hammer just kind of bounce off the strings a little bit. So that's it. That's all of the instruments. In addition to the instruments themselves, we have two categories here called additional samples and processed samples. These are a wide variety of different sounds. A lot of them are synthesizers that sound or have the impression of the traditional Chinese instruments. For example, the aged Erhu cassette. The odds of that being an actual Erhu that's been processed and played through maybe a cassette player is pretty low, but it does have the same sort of feeling as an aged Erhu. And we've got all the same instruments here. Some of them may have been processed. Now, there's actually some really interesting context to using these sort of processed samples, in that the history of electronic instruments in China is very short, started in the 80s, and a lot of the earliest electronic tones were seeking to replicate the traditional Chinese instruments, so that you didn't necessarily need an orchestra of traditional instrument players to create a tone. Or if you wanted to play an instrument that you don't personally play, you would be able to buy a cheap electronic instrument that could recreate the sound of a Dizi. Now, it doesn't sound anything like a Dizi, it sounds like this. But it does the same job, and you can still sing to it, or you can still play the classic melodies. If you're interested in learning more about this, I made a whole documentary about it called The Lost Keys of China. Highly recommended. Tells the story of Mr. Bernie Krause and how he visited China with a big old Moog synthesizer, demonstrated to the Chinese government about how this is how synthesizers have no cultural bias, and you can use a Moog modular setup to emulate the sound of a Yangqin or what have you. So these samples actually do have a little bit of history to them. Whether or not Arturia knew that when they included it, I don't know. But these sounds are very relevant to the history of electronic music in China. So, whether or not you like the sound of some of these synthesized tones are up to you. You've got an amped Guqin, which is sort of a cardinal sin in China Wave for reasons I'm not going to get into now, but, I'm sure someone out there will make good music with it, and that's all that matters. And lastly, you have some additional samples. Now there's nothing really, Chinese about these particular samples, but they're just a collection of you know, different sounds that you would eventually combine with the traditional instruments. So you've now had a look at all of the samples included inside of Yangtze. We've got our bass Dizi, Erhu, Guqin, Pipa, Xiao, and Yangqin, plus a collection of additional samples. The nature of Augmented Yangtze is to combine these samples together. So if you wanted to, say, take a Pipa sound here and play it alongside a Xiao, we would open up our second sampler here. So in our second sampler, I can go into the title and load up, say, a Xiao, and now we can hear a Pipa and a Xiao being played together. So you could take a traditional Chinese instrument and combine it with one of these additional samples, and you're going to start to get a sound that is very, very distinct and unique. If I were to combine the Pipa with the flute tape, so we've had a look at all of the different samples, and I'm sure you're already starting to think about what you could do with these sounds. But before we get into the synthesizers, let's talk about what we can do with these sample sounds. I'm going to just work with the Xiao sound. What can we do to change the way this instrument sounds and is played? A quintessential skill in playing with synthesizers and samples is ADSR, the amplitude, envelope, attack, decay, sustain, and release. This is the nature in which the instrument is played back. For example, if I were to play a few notes, when I take my hand off the keyboard, it ends pretty quickly, which makes it sound a little bit artificial. What if I wanted that to last a little bit longer? This is called the release. How long do I want the sound to release for? If I increase the release here, now it'll take 4.53 seconds for the note to reach silence. This makes your sound quite a bit more flowing and longer, which is perhaps better for something more relaxing and melodious. Or the release could be set to 0, so that the instant I take my hand off, which, makes it sound rather artificial, but as a result, it sounds a lot more like the earliest samples, which didn't have this kind of control. So when the sound kind of starts and stops on an instant, sort of sounds like a cheap or maybe old school kind of sampler piano. Attack works in the same way. Attack is the speed at which it takes to start from silence and reach the maximum volume. So right now our attack is set to 0, so the note will start right away. But if I were to lengthen the attack, now the sound will take its time to build to that full volume. And what's really nice about the Augmented series is that you can actually see your notes being played and where they are on your amplitude envelope. Decay and sustain are a little bit more abstract compared to the attack and release, but it's not too hard to grasp. The sustain is the volume at which the instrument sustains. For example, if I were to lower the sustain very, very quiet, we're going to have this peak here, but then it's going to sustain very, very quietly. If I were to bring the sustain all the way up, then there's no change. It'll just reach its full volume and stay there until we release. The decay is how long it takes to reach the sustained volume. So for example, if I were to bring the decay to, let's say, 2.8 seconds and bring the sustain down to 0, the sound will attack, spend 2 point whatever seconds decaying to our sustain, which is 0. So if our sustain was, say very, very quiet, we'll hear our note and it will decay in volume and stay at a very quiet tone until we inevitably release. Using this envelope, we can really create the shape of our sound. So let's say we wanted to make sort of like a swell and a slow release. We can adjust the curves of this shape using this little tool here. So now if we have a nice little slow attack with a curve and a decay curve going down, you can actually see the shape of our sound here. What does this sound like? Let's make that attack just a little bit longer. You hear that? You can really see and hear that exponential curve. We can even make that decay a little bit shorter, so we have even more of like a whipped. Yeah, isn't that nice? Now, being able to control our envelope like that is so helpful, not only for like performing and building our sound, but for contrasting the other instruments we're using. So we have this Xiao, which is like a whipping sound. If we were to combine this with a Pipa, which is a very clearly plucked sound, we could have that Xiao swell up after our Pipa sound by increasing our attack. And now listening, we'll hear Pipa and the swell together. This is the nature of the Augmented series and combining samplers in interesting, unique ways. It really helps to have a good fundamental understanding of these envelopes because it can just allow you to create any sort of shape of sound. Every one of these instruments was recorded with an array of microphones, and we can actually adjust which microphones we're hearing to sort of change the nature of the sound. Those controls are here. We have width, close, width, far, and mix between them. The close microphones will create a more intimate, personal feeling, and the farther microphones will sound a bit more ambient. So if I were to adjust the mix down to 0, we're only hearing the close microphones. And if you're wearing headphones, this will be quite a bit more obvious. It sounds like the instrument is right next to us, very, very, very close. That's in contrast to using the far microphones. Listening here, those microphones sound like they're on the opposite side of a room, which integrates some air between the microphones and the instrument, sort of like reverb. Now that's sort of like a Z dimension, right? How far away we are from the instrument. But we also have an X, how wide these microphones sound. And it makes a difference when listening, again, on headphones or with a sort of a stereoscopic playback system. I'll bring the mix down so we only hear our close microphones, and I'm going to turn the width all the way to 0. We hear one microphone right in the middle. However, if I were to bring this width all the way up, we can hear it makes a pretty big difference. Even though all these instruments are generally symmetrical, there's still, the lower strings are on one side of the instrument, the higher strings are on another, so there is a difference between what your left ear and right ear would hear. So having control over the width of these microphones is actually pretty helpful. It's very obvious with the close microphones. With the farther microphones, it's, a little bit less obvious. Having the width all the way down would be like there's one microphone across the room, or there's two in the opposite corners of the room. So it's up to you to choose how you want to utilize these different microphones. For example, we could have a Pipa sound with the microphones very close to us, and a Xiao sound with the microphones very far from us. Really puts the Pipa immediately in the center of the sound, really as the foreground element, and puts the Xiao in sort of the background. And it a little bit helps. That's the extent of the control we have over the microphone placement. Now, there's a few other controls here we can talk about. We have the tuning. In this instance, if we wanted to have the Xiao play, say, 5 steps lower than the Pipa, for a quick little, background harmony, we can adjust the fine tuning if you want to be a little out of tune. Now the tuning is the note that's being played back. If you want to actually adjust the sample tuning, we can go from instead of the keyboard offset down to the coarse. So now, if I were to play the Xiao, we're hearing the Xiao sound tuned down 1 octave. Which sounds not quite like a Xiao anymore, but it's a new texture, something we can play with. So that's the extent of the sampler. That's all you really need to know for now. Of course, you can have some panning up here if you so choose. You could have the Pipa go to the left ear and the Xiao go to the right if you so choose. This might be a little more helpful with, say, 2 sustained notes. We could have a Xiao going to one ear and, you know, the Dizi going to the other. And it doesn't have to be so 50-50. We can have just a little bit to each. And there's going to be more to it. Now, that is the sampler, inside and out. You could even pause the tutorial here and just go through these sampler sounds before even getting into the synthesizers. There's so much you could do with the sampler sounds that are available here. So I would encourage you to pause and just have a go at some of the samplers and see, you know, what you can do with them. But next, we're going to get into the other sound source, the synthesizers. Just as we have all of these different sample sources, we have not 1, but 5 different synthesizer engines. I could talk for hours about each one. I'm going to just kind of go over them each briefly and how they work, just to show you how they differ from another and how you could go about using them. But they're all here for you to explore, and if you hear one you like, by all means, check out a tutorial on granular synthesis or wavetable synthesis and just see what's out there. Let's start with analog. What is analog synthesis? Analog is sort of a catch-all term. It refers to when synthesizers were made without digital components. They were analog oscillators, analog filters, and all sorts of different electronic components. Now, clearly we're on a computer, so we're not doing an analog synthesizer. So this is an analog emulating synthesizer. It's emulating how synthesizers were when they were using electronic components. What does that really mean? Don't worry about it. The analog engine is what we call a subtractive synthesizer. This is sort of your 101 how synthesizers work. It starts with things called oscillators. Oscillators generate an electronic tone with a waveform. We're going to start with oscillator 1. It sounds like this. That is a sine wave. We can change what oscillator we're using. If I were to change this to, say, you know, sawtooths and triangles and square waves, these are different oscillators creating different tones. And we can combine different oscillators. If I were to combine, say, this square wave with this sine wave, it'll sound like this. I throw in a sawtooth wave, why not? And we have a noise generator. Noise being exactly what it sounds like, a white noise generator. You might wonder why we do that. That's just to add a little bit of texture, you know, if you want to have like a more striking sound. And lastly, we have something called FM. Frequency modulation is... I'm trying to think of a way to describe this without going on a crazy tangent. It's basically changing the way in which these oscillators interact with one another. Say, instead of just adding them on top of one another, maybe they're multiplying or dividing or just doing something. The oscillators are affecting each other. As we increase the FM, the sound will get more complex. So using just these oscillators and the FM, we can already create a wide range of sounds, but there's quite a bit more control we have. And that, well, of course we have the same amplitude envelope as the sampler here. If you've ever used a synthesizer before, you're probably looking at this interface thinking, hey, this is like a little limited. This doesn't look like a fully fledged synthesizer. That's because all of our additional controls are hidden here. We have a fully fledged analog synthesizer here, and we can control, you know, again, there's our 3 oscillators here. We have our noise control. We can change the color of our noise here. We can tune and detune the different oscillators. So if you want to have one, say, down the octave, you can have them be at different, intervals here. We can have the tune drifting here. We have width control over each of the oscillators. We have noise control. We can, change some modulation stuff. There's a lot of control. The analog, the subtractive synthesis engine is a really, really good place to just start playing with different sounds and hear what it creates. And on top of the analog synthesizer, we also have a filter. A filter, aptly named, filters out certain frequencies. So by default, it's a low-pass filter, which is going to filter out some of the higher frequencies. We have some control over this filter. We can pick different kinds. We can have a little resonance peak here. Samples aside, you could just sit and play with the synthesizer if you want. That's the analog synth engine. Now again, we could go into some theory here and talk about how this works and how we can go about using it, but there's other synthesizers to try as well. So in addition to analog, we have some other ones. Let's start a little bit simpler before we get into the more complex ones. Simpler. What is a simpler? A simpler is, in many ways, a sampler, but it has a little bit more control over the sample that's played back. It's not about accurately portraying the sample sound as our sampler does, but it's more about playing with that sound and seeing what can be done with it. Let's pick an instrument. Let's try this Dizi articulations. So a lot of the sounds use the same instruments as the sampler, and they even have just different forms of articulation, and there's even some other instruments in here that aren't included in the sampler, such as singing bowls and some percussion. So definitely worth looking into the simpler. Don't sleep on it. Looking at the simpler interface here, we can see the sample portrayed as a waveform. And we have just like a little bit more control over how the sound is played back. We can change the, whether it loops or not. It's going to play the sample, but it's going to loop. And we can see on the waveform where the note is, and as it reaches, it will loop back. We can change where it's going to loop, where the sound is going to start. You can change the direction in which it plays. We can have the whole thing play backwards. So you can create some pretty interesting things out of a very simple tone. There's, just like the analog synthesizer, there's all sorts of different controls we have over here. We can really get in here. We can have different parts of the sample go to different keys that you're playing in. So you could have the beginning of the sample play different notes when you play a lower note as opposed to higher notes. I'm fighting every urge to just sit and explain everything about this synthesizer, but we have to move on. The simpler is basically playing back a pre-recorded sound in an interesting way. And there's a lot of tones in here for you to look into, so I highly recommend checking out the simpler first, if nothing as an addition to the sampler. And if nothing else, you can use it to add, say, a vinyl crackle to your sound. So if you want something to kind of sound lo-fi here. But there's more to it. There's all sorts of different noises. You can use textures or sound effects. You can even use impacts if you want to add something to, say, a Pipa strike. You want it to be accentuated and strengthened by a cinematic impact. There's a lot to it. Definitely recommend looking into it. But let's move on. In addition to the simpler, we have something called Granular. Granular is another very rich and interesting topic, which, oh goodness, this video has to be under 2 hours. Let's make this a little simpler here. Granular will work on the same principle as the simpler. It will play back a pre-recorded sound and do something interesting to it, except instead of playing through the sound, it will play tiny little granules of the sound. So it's very rich and interesting the way it plays back. Let's find a good example. If I were to play a few notes on this sacral flutes, well, it might sound like a flute at first, but what we're seeing is little tiny pieces of the sample being played back. If I were to decrease the size of those, it's a little more obvious as to what's happening. We're playing back tiny little snippets of this sound very, very, very quickly. We can change how many are being played back at once. Or where in the sample they're being played back from. How long each granule is. Granular is getting more and more popular these days because it is so rich. The sound that you can create is so complex and unique. Any sample you put into this thing can be turned into something ambient and gorgeous and just one of a kind. So there's all sorts of different presets in here for you to mess around with. And of course you can take one and you can just load in whatever sound you please and just be able to create some very interesting tones. Granular, again, gorgeous, gorgeous sound-making technology. I highly recommend diving into it and spending some time with it. And I'm fighting every urge, again, to really explain how this stuff works, but we do have to move on. Just quick note, a lot of control you have over here. You can map different samples to different parts of the keyboard. You can pick different samples or different sections of the sound based on, what notes being played. You can have them switch randomly. You can pick different samples to trigger at different times. There's a lot of control here, which very, very fun to dive into. There's two left. We have harmonic synthesizers. Now, unfortunately, I'm not really able to describe this one very well because I don't completely understand harmonics, but it's basically when you play a note, either you sing or play a piano or something, you're playing at a certain frequency, which will generate the tone you're used to. For example, A is at 440 hertz, right? But you're not only playing one frequency, you're playing a range. That frequency will create sub-frequencies, both up and down on a frequency chain here. And a harmonic synthesizer basically accentuates those frequencies in order to create some very interesting bell-like tones and all sorts of just interesting things. So you can kind of see here, and I'm sorry if I'm someone who's really into harmonics is probably screaming at the screen right now saying I'm getting it wrong. Feel free to describe it in the comments and do me a favor. But more or less, the harmonic is a very pure tone generally, and you can control some of these frequencies here. Which ones are accentuated, which ones aren't. The frequency modulation, the ratio between the even and the odd frequencies here. FM synthesis is just a very, very deep and rich world that would take more or less a lifetime to explain. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. Just have a look at the harmonic synthesizer and see, what it can do for you. Lastly, we have wavetable synthesis. Wavetable is a lot like the subtractive synthesis, except instead of, as opposed to using oscillators, the waveform is generated in a different way. You have different waves you can choose from. So you can pick all sorts of different shapes and sounds, and it's portrayed in 3D because it's not just a single waveform, it's a longer one, and you can have it change over time. So we can move through that waveform by going back and forth. I know the 3D wavetable looks really, really crazy and complex, and it is a lot of fun, but it's more or less just like one waveform over time, and you can just change which time you're listening to. But we also have a few additional controls over the waveform here. We have phase distortion and wave folding, which is just basically taking the waveform and shaping it in different ways. And again, if you're interested in the sounds that this thing can create, some very complex and typically pretty aggressive sounds, I highly recommend having a look at Wavetable. I think the most popular one these days is Serum. There's just all sorts of different forms that Wavetable synthesis can take. If you're not particularly interested in building the synthesizer tone yourself, of course, there's a whole collection of presets here. Pull up a sample of a traditional Chinese instrument here and go through your different Wavetable presets here and just see what sounds nice to you. Just as we have 2 slots for samplers, we also have 2 slots for synthesizers. So we can play back multiple synthesizers at once to create a very one-of-a-kind sound. And with that, we have all 4 sounds covered. The Augmented series basically combines 2 samplers and 2 synthesizers. When you have all 4 going at once, I mean, you're gonna have a sound that's just 100% unique. There are 4 sounds. You now have a full understanding of the sampler and the synthesizer. Now there's quite a bit more you can do from here, but looking at the advanced panel, congratulations, you now understand pretty much everything you see up here. There's a few other things here, you know, time multiplier and, you know, velocity to time. This stuff will just take a couple minutes to learn on your own, but I don't want to muddy the waters too much. I want to move on and talk about the other types of control that we have over our sound. As you see, we're looking at the A/B layer window here. We have other windows here to play with as well. There's a lot of things we can do to control our sound. We're going to start with the effects window, because that's going to be kind of the simplest to cover here. I'm going to turn off our synthesizers for now, and let's just work with the sampler for a little while. So the effects are pretty straightforward. Going into the effects window here, we can affect layers A and layer B differently. And there's 2 slots for each layer. So right now the Pipa is playing back in layer A, and we have a whole collection of sounds. We have a filter, we've got EQ, compressors, different types of distortions and choruses, some phasers and pans, and different delays and reverbs. So it's up to you to really figure out what you want to explore and what you want to get into. Chorus is never a bad place to start. You know, nothing particularly cutting edge here. It's just some basic, basic sound controls. The compressor is super helpful if we have, say, some kind of ambient layer happening in layer B, and we want the Pipa to really stand out. Bring that threshold down, add a makeup gain. Now you can hear that Pipa really, really cuts out of the ambient sound. All sorts of other things for you to explore. Again, chorus is great. The one really particularly unique thing that Arturia does is their pitch shift delay. So you can change the pitch of each delay feedback. So if I were to bring this down, say 5 semitones every note, but personally, I think that Arturia's tape delay is kind of my favorite. They do that very, very well. You might be wondering why you would add effects inside of the instrument here as opposed to adding them inside of your DAW. Of course, you know, there's a lot more effects you can add inside of the DAW and you have a little bit more control over it, but it is very nice to be able to affect layers A and layer B differently. And just being able to create a sound and have it load up inside of Yangtze and maintain that either compressed or delay sound, it's very just convenient to have some effects built into the plugin. And there's distortion, bit crush, there's all sorts you can do. Just being able to affect layer A and B differently is great. Now, you also have a master effects bus. This affects both layers A and layer B. And I believe it's limited to one delay and one reverb. So you can pick one of the 3 delays they have here, whether it's tape or digital, and add some reverb to the master bus. You also have presets for that as well, you know, if you want to get into a cathedral here. You have different presets for each of the different delay types, ping pong. So that's kind of that's the master bus. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Those are the effects you can add. Let's move on to the arpeggiator. If you're new to electronic music, using an arpeggiator is a very common technique. It's basically putting in a series of MIDI notes and creating a sequence out of them. For example, playing a few notes here. This is a sequence of notes based on the notes I'm playing. We can change the direction in which it plays. And for example, right now we're going up, we can go back down. We can change the rate at which it's playing back. Let's go to 16th notes here. We can change the swing and the octave. I mean, all the basic controls for an arpeggiator are here. But there's a little bit more here in the Augmented series, which we can have a look at. So I'm going to bring this to 1/8, and let's see what we can do. First, I'm going to go back to up. We can change the gates. The gate is how long each note plays for. Right now it's a little short. We can go nice and short if we bring it down here. You hear how each note's very, very short. However, if we were to maybe make a few long and a few short. Each step we can have a different gate. Same goes for velocity, which would allow us to have certain notes be louder than other notes. We can have it go down over time. So you can see you can create a really interesting pattern just by using the velocity and the gate alone. You can also randomize these parameters just in case you want to be a little bit more human, a little bit more generative each time. But perhaps most interestingly about the Augmented series is it has a built-in chord function. So it's inside of the arpeggiator, but we actually don't need to use an arpeggiator to turn it on. We just go to chord down here. Now if I put in a single note, in this case a C, it will play back a chord. Let's try a minor 7th chord. And if we do that in conjunction with the arpeggiator, now it will not play back a single note, it will play back that chord in an arpeggio. We can even set one of these steps to play the chord, and then the rest will be an arpeggio. For example, so you can see you can already create some pretty complicated things using this chord, and just having a little chord selection here is a really, really helpful tool to have. You don't even need to be using the arpeggiator when you do this. I think it's great. So that's it. That's all there is to it. The arpeggiator is pretty simple. You can turn on and off certain steps, and you can really just, have some fun with all the functions that are inside of here. There's 2 windows left. We have modulation and macros. I've saved modulation and macros for last because it's a little tricky to describe in a simple way, but I think now that you've understood the layers and the effects in the arpeggio, it shouldn't be too hard to grasp what modulation is. Modulation in synthesis and in electronic music is using something to affect something else. And that could mean so many different things. And it usually has to do with changing the timbre of your sound or the rate of something changing. I'm going to show you the different kinds of modulation and show you what the sources are and what you can change as a result of doing something to your sound. It's quite fun. The modulation can basically take any of these knobs or anything we've done so far and change it as the result of either inputted data or something, anything. So let's have a look, right? let's start with the synthesizer here. We've got a nice pure analog synth. Let's listen to this oscillator. We have oscillator 1, which is just a sine wave. And now we have oscillator 2, which is a square wave down the octave. Let's say I want oscillator 2 to come in and out, to kind of give the sound a sort of pulsing. Yeah, just like that. How can I do that automatically without having to have, a knob going back and forth? We can use modulation. If I open up the modulation window over here, we have these little lines going. These are called low frequency oscillators. It's called a low frequency oscillator because it's an oscillator much like these inside of our analog synth, but it's a much lower frequency in the sense that it doesn't happen multiple times per second. It happens as slow as you want it to go. Right now, it's going at 0.090 hertz, or we can have it be like time. So let's say once per half note. So right now, this LFO isn't actually doing anything because it's not mapped to anything. It's just a mathematical value. It's 0 in the middle. Up here, it's at +1, and down here, it's at -1, right? So it's 100%, 0%, -100%, 0, 1, 0, -1. Just oscillating forever. You see there's a little plus sign here. That means we can modulate it. So if I click this plus sign, it's going to highlight, it's going to ask me, what do I want to do with it? Well, I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to go to my LFO number 1, and I'm going to increase this value, which means I am mapping 100% of the LFO's value to the oscillator. So now, if I were to play a note, wasn't that interesting? Now it's starting to do something. Let's have a look at our modulation and see what's happening. So you see that the volume of the second oscillator is now mapped to the LFO. However, it's not doing maybe exactly what you would expect. The volume is maxed out at the peak, but once it reaches 0, it's already quiet, so nothing's happening down here. This is because it's all about relativity. Right now, our default volume is off. So if I were to say, by default, it's around here, maybe mid-volume, let's say 7 decibels. Now you can hear, once it's below 0, it starts to be quieter and then eventually completely quiet. So using this oscillator, this is the basic form of modulation. And you can already imagine all the sorts of things. We could do the same thing with oscillator number 3. In fact, we could have it be the opposite. We can have it go the other way. If I go to LFO number 1 and bring it down, now it will get quieter when oscillator 2 gets louder. You can see the little modulation window here. It's opposite. So if I were to make oscillator 3, say, trying a sawtooth wave, you can already hear we can use effects over time. The LFO is currently synchronized to the song, so if you had a drum beat, it would actually stay in time with your song. So you can create some very interesting rhythmic properties here. The LFO is just one modulation source. There's actually several, and you can see them down here. We've got 2 separate LFOs. We could have LFOs going at different rates. We could also have different shapes. It doesn't have to necessarily be up and down, up and down. We can have just ramping down. We can have square, which is kind of like on-off. For example, if we were to route oscillator number 3 to LFO number 2 all the way, you can see the rate just going on, off, on, off. It's going to blink on and off. And the different shapes can really do quite a bit. And you can even see where these LFOs are being routed to here using these little macros and change the amount at which it's being affected. Let's have a look at our functions. Functions are much like LFOs, but there's a couple of different things we can do. We can change the shape ourselves. We can generate some really crazy things. So let's take this noise level and map it to function number 1. So now the noise is going to follow whatever path it is that I draw. You can change the rate, of course. And it's not just drawing shapes. There's all sorts of different things you can do. You can have it be an envelope as the result of the note you play. You can build an envelope here. You can have it trigger based on whenever you play a note. Same, using a key trigger. Now you can hear the noise starting every time I play a note and then ramping down to 0. So we have 2 separate functions that we could be doing with. We have rhythmic things we can play with, all sorts of just interesting little... Using white noise, you can create like a sort of percussion sound within your synthesizer, all sorts of crazy stuff. You can already hear the potential. A lot of weird stuff in here. Between the LFO and the function, there's all sorts you can do. We also have a random number generator, which is good if you want something that's sort of, randomized and sort of glitchy, perhaps. You can change the rate at which something is changed. You can change the amplitude so it's not quite as crazy. This might make for like a good detuning sort of thing. I'm gonna take the detune and map it to the random here. And now we can change the randomness at which it's sort of detunes. So it's up to you to, use it in a creative way. Maybe we could try the FM and see what happens. Mapping the FM to, let's say random 2. And you can see the rate is very clear. We can make that happen a little faster. We can even make it smoother, so it's not quite as, pointed. We can change the amount, so it's more extreme. So if you want something really random, maybe FM isn't the most smooth example, but you can tell that there's all sorts of things we could do. More or less, everything you see in the layers window is manipulatable by modulation. But just having a look at this menu, anything you see can be affected over the course of time or as the result of something. So the LFO, the function, and the random are just 3 of the modulation sources, or 6 rather. You have these 6 sources. But it's not just about these number generators. There's a lot you can do to change your sound. We also have the keyboard functions: velocity, aftertouch, modulation wheel, and keyboard. These are inputted data as a result of how you play. Velocity, which you're probably familiar with, is how hard you strike the note. So right now, actually looking down here, you can see the velocity goes to the amplitude, which means the harder I press, the louder the note, right? I can make this really extreme, or I could just turn this off. So now it's going to play regardless of my velocity. No matter how hard I press, the velocity is not going to the amplitude. So usually, velocity affects volume, but we can do different things with that velocity. If we wanted the velocity to map to something, say, the frequency modulation of the synthesizer, well, it works the exact same way. We go to the FM here, we click the X, and we go to velocity and bring it all the way up. Now, having a look at our modulation section, we can see our velocity here. You can hear the harder I press, the more the FM opens up. I'm going to turn that velocity to amp back on because that's really what I'm used to. We can even adjust the velocity of our curve. We can have it be a very low velocity unless we really hit it hard. If you really want to exaggerate the difference, I can add a point here. So now, even if I press kind of medium hard, it will still play quietly, but I have to really press hard in order to reach that open threshold here. So that's velocity. You can really put it towards any one of these parameters, and I'm sure you've already got all sorts of crazy ideas. Another version of velocity is called aftertouch. Aftertouch is sort of velocity over the course of time. Some controllers have what's called aftertouch, and if I play a note here, have a look at this curve here. See what happens. If I press harder, the value goes up, and if I press less hard, the value goes down. So let me undo the velocity effect here, and let's map aftertouch to, say, the filter cutoff. So I'm going to go to the cutoff here, map it to the aftertouch, and I'll do the same with this one over here. And instead of a Guqin, let's try a Xiao. So now, if I press gently, we'll hear the sound very filtered down. And as I press harder, the filter opens up. Now, it's a little tricky for me with this particular controller, so let's really use that curve to make it more obvious. I don't want it to be too easy to press hard. That's velocity and aftertouch. Modulation wheel and keyboard, these are both different functions if you have a proper MIDI keyboard. You know, the modulation wheel is a very, very common way to control some parameter of your sound. And while we're here in the keyboard window, we can have a look. We have glide, of course. And you can control your pitch bend, should you have a pitch bend wheel you'd like to use. Now, that's the majority of modulation, but that actually brings us back to where we started, which are our macros. You'll see here, color, morph, time, motion, FX, delay, reverb. Looks familiar, right? That's because these knobs, these macros, are something that are programmed inside the instrument based on modulation. All it is just some predefined modulation sources. So by default, color is affecting the cutoff frequency of filter A and filter B. So if I were to have a look at this macro, or even just going to the interface here, now we know exactly what color is doing. It's affecting the filter. The morph is really just changing the ratio between the different parts. Morph in the middle means we will hear 50% of all four parts. If we move morph to the left, we're going to hear more of layer A, part 1, and less of layer B, part 1. And vice versa. So now we know exactly what that big knob right in the middle of Augmented Yangtze is doing. It's just turning stuff on and off. It's just crossfading between the different layers. That's all it is. But it is making a big difference, right? Because we have four very different sounds. Having a look at the time is currently affecting the sampler 1 release and the sampler 2 release. We could have that affect all of them, right? If I go to my layers here, and let's go to these two different synthesizers as well, let's grab a couple different things. I can go to this release time, have it be affected by time, and same for the release of synth number 2. And now, going back to our macros, we can see the time is affecting the release of all four sounds. So if I were to play a note here, with the time set to maximum, it will ring for a very long time. I can reduce that. So looking at our window here, time is basically how long the note will last. time set to 0, it's pretty quick. So there we go. Of course, there are defaults, and there's suggested uses of things like time. We could have, instead of release, it could be the attacks of each of the envelopes. Motion has a special trait here. Motion is set to a built-in tremolo effect by default. So by playing a note and increasing the motion, it's affecting a tremolo, which is built into the effect bus. We can, disable that if we wanted to and have the motion affect something else. For example, we could have the motion affect the arpeggio rate, right? So let's say I were having an arpeggiator going by going to advanced, arpeggiator, going. We could have the synchronization rate be affected by the motion, right? So we bring this down. Now our motion is affecting the rate at which notes are played back. The last couple macros are hidden in here. They're in the effects. We have FXA, FXB, delay and reverb. Delay and reverb are pretty straightforward. They're just the dry, wet amount of the master bus delay that we talked about. And same with the reverb. And the FXA and FXB knobs here are currently affecting FXA1. For example, if we add a bit crusher sound here, FXA will basically add the wet amount to that bit crusher. So why do we use macros at all? The reason is, if you use one of Arturia's keyboards, such as the Key Lab Essential or the Mini Lab, there's going to be 8 knobs. And those knobs are, by default, mapped to the morph, color, time, motion. So as you adjust these knobs, it will change the parameters that you set inside of this instrument. That's sort of the beauty of these macro knobs. If you just feel like composing and making music and maybe not focusing on actually building the sound, it's nice to be able to have all these just very basic controls right in front of you without having to get into the nitty-gritty of, what's affecting your bit crusher or, how to modulate things over time. Just having access to some of these tools are great. Experienced electronic musicians will tell you that a great way to learn an instrument like this is to go through the presets that were made by the people who created the instrument and just see how they're built. See how they're combining different effects here. You can go to the macros and see what they're set to, have a look at what they're doing with their modulations, and really just, take advantage of all of the different presets that were here. Or if you've come this far and you find out that making all this stuff feels too complicated and you just want to get to playing with some really cool sounds, of course, this library is full of different sounds that you can use and create music with. So that's it. That is Augmented Yangtze inside and out. I hope you found something here that you're interested in. I hope that there's some tones here that you want to play with. I really, really encourage you to have a look at some of these instruments and what they can do for you. Please, if you create any sounds that you want to share, don't hesitate to upload them and share them with your fellow creators. And really, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoy this plugin, and I'll see you next time.